Everyone, welcome to this informal podcast that I have the pleasure of hosting and interviewing someone whom has, I would say, definitely made waves in the nutrition um, theatre of war, as I'd like to say it. He is an Irish gentleman by the name of Donal O'Neill. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You're going to have to. It's not as bad as my last name. Donal has done several very informative expose documentaries, and he has, in that process, had quite a journey and discovering or self-discovery with regards to what is possible from a nutritional aspect and point of view. Without any further ado, Donal, first question. Firstly, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You must forgive me. I do have a slight. Anyway, you're originally from Ireland, and just to begin with, you're growing up, your nutrition, your household. What was the nutrition like back in those days?
I would say it was pretty good, Sean, because I was born in 1971. And back then, Ireland was piss poor, as we like to say. So really nobody had any money. Ireland was a very basic country. We were and still are, I think, great people, but there was no wealth to speak of. And food was very straightforward. And to go back a generation, my parents would have told me that the only time that they would have seen fruit would have been in their stocking at Christmas time. So there would have been no fruit for the war generation, let's say. By the time you get into the 1970s, we had bananas and oranges and, maybe the odd apple and apples during the summer, of course. But that was kind of it. Vegetables were cabbage, parsnips, carrots, potatoes, all of the cliches that you could think of. I didn't know what an avocado was until I was well into my 20s. So it was super basic. Breakfast was porridge. And, on the weekend, we had, well, they call it the English breakfast. We call it an Ulster fry or a full Irish if you're talking in Dublin or Cork. And, everything was cooked in, butter and bit of lard and stuff like that. The vegetable oils and the things we see today really only crept in when I was probably coming into my teens, certainly in my house. So my mother cooked everything from scratch, baked her own bread, and that was how it was. It was very simple.
So, so I would say that's pretty much a low carbohydrate. In comparison to what the modern diet is today, because you only mentioned kind of bread once. Yeah, what was the sort of the makeup of it? I mean, in relation to what is available today.
You mean the bread?
Well, it's the portion size of your carbohydrate daily intake.
Well, porridge in the mornings was an interesting one. Like Ireland was built on porridge, and funny enough, I found for myself and some other athletes who would have sworn by it, it proved to be devastating to our blood sugars as we got into adult life. But that's a separate issue. I still think porridge would beat Cocoa Pops out the gate. And when the cereal started to emerge, my mum was pretty protective of it. She weren't allowed to touch a cereal unless you'd had your porridge, and you might have got a little bit of cereal. And then when orange juice crept in the 80s, we were given like a thimbleful. You weren't glugging, half a liter of orange juice. There was no real abundance. Everything was pretty strict. And, in my primary school, I recall maybe one kid who might have been slightly, I don't even want to say overweight, but let's say a bit flaccid. But, kids were lean and nobody was really being overfed in those days. So it was, even if you were eating food, it was typically unprocessed. and it certainly didn't come packed with a ton of sugar and ultra processed nonsense. And I think that crept in probably in the decade after my own childhood. So I got lucky, I guess.
That's actually very interesting because I was watching not to digress too much, but I was watching a documentary on the real right stuff, the first the origins of the space program, and they've got that scene of everyone watching the first launches of the rocket into space, and the figures of all the people watching were definitely lean, nothing like you see today. The obesity problem hadn't crept in. Okay, so with regards to that, you obviously something had changed, because I would say that the what you're describing right now, what you have described with regards to the nutrition that you grew up into your teens, was, I would say, very much possible. Where did it all go wrong for you?
I would say it never really went wrong for me. I'm not somebody who suffered anything, touch wood. I was an international underage track and field athlete. Then I got a couple of senior vests, and then I got injured very young. But I'd also been a member of the most successful Gaelic football team in the history of that sport at a schools level. I had a cousin who was a superstar of the game and would go on to become one of the greatest of all time. So I was doing a huge amount of sport. The only thing that went wrong for me were really injuries. I didn't have any other ailments. I got bad injuries from just overuse and poor athlete management, you might say. But again, you're talking about the mid 80s. People didn't really know what they were doing. I had a wonderful athletics coach who did. But when you were good at multiple sports, it was always very difficult, because you were going from, in my case, one athletics coach and an athletics club that were phenomenal and had great expertise, and then presenting myself at the local GA pitch where everybody meant well, but they were essentially clueless. So in that scenario, when you've got a kid who's being, pulled back and forth to do maybe 14, 15 sessions a week, something's going to break down. And of course, we know why that happens. But nutritionally, I never had any issues or warning signs. The warning sign was not myself, it was my father, because my father and his generation were very famous Gaelic footballers. He played in an iconic Gaelic football team in the 1960s. And my uncle, in fact, is regarded as kind of one of the Messi or the Pele or the Maradona or that type of ilk in Gaelic games. He was an absolute legend.
Wow.
But my dad had a heart attack when he was about 70. That type of heart attack you don't even know you're having, but it is definitely a heart attack. And that was like back in 08, 09, and I was living in Malta at that time. Shortly after that, I moved down to Cape Town. I didn't intend to live and stay here, but by the time I got here, I'd been conducting my own research into why that might have happened, why my dad never put on weight. He remained very healthy. When they did the stress tests and that type of thing on him with his corporate programs, they continually asked him, was he an athlete? Because his system was superior to his peers. So, his system remained solid, intact, athletic, but, he had the heart attack. So that made me question everything, because as we know from the great Prof. Noakes, he set out in his career in the 70s to tear down the myth that running a marathon would be protective against the development of atherosclerosis, which was kind of set in stone at that time. I believed that. I thought if you were fit, you're not going to get heart disease. And yet here was my dad. So that was the trigger for me. And then I was living in Malta at the time. I always remember the first thing I did, I took out sugar and starches from my diet for a week. And, Malta had tremendous Mediterranean food, including pizzas, pastas. So I took those out, and I immediately noticed energy levels just leveled. I would have created very badly. I was still training quite hard at that stage, and I would have noticed that my energy levels would crater on a big day, and almost instantaneously that feeling went away. So I thought maybe there's something here. And the other small point there was my cousin's a dentist, and I'd been home to Ireland, and he checked me up. He said, "Oh, we're going to have to stick a filling in that back tooth there." So I didn't get back to him for about 6 weeks, during which time I'd started my own little self-test. And when I went back, he was poking around and he asked me, and I said, well, I don't feel anything. He said, let me just x-ray that again. And he said, listen, the tooth's fine. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, what have you been doing since I saw you? I said, I'm mucking around. I haven't eaten any sugar and I've, cut way back on starches. And he said, well, if everybody did that, I wouldn't have a business here. So that's when I learned that teeth could regenerate. 10 years later, I ran into Dr. Stephen Lynn down in Australia when we launched the Piopidad book in London. And he, took that further for me and sent me down a direction that led to one of my later movies, because clearly dental health is a very good flag for the rest of the body. And to this day, it defies logic for me that those two are not more closely enshrined. Medicine seems to leave out the mouth, and dentistry seems to leave out the body. But I think there's great awareness to be had from dental health. So that was my first little sign that, there might be something in this. Your teeth could actually regenerate.
It's actually very interesting that your dad was a trigger, because I would say, as a society, we have become sort of compliant to say that, no, he's 70, he's had a heart problem. You kind of, that's kind of normal. Well, I wouldn't say normal, but it's becoming more and more accepted. So I think just from yourself from a personal standpoint, your investigation, your inquiring mind, this is not acceptable. He was an elite athlete. This is just not acceptable. I mean, according to Prof. Tim Noakes, I think the mainstream people would just sit back and say, "Oh, it's just unfortunate. That's how it is," And I think that is a kind of a trend that is becoming more prominent nowadays. So when did the link between Prof. Tim Noakes, you pretty much based in Malta, Ireland, Europe. When did how well known was Prof. Noakes? Was it only when you came to Cape Town in South Africa did you, find out about the Prof?
Yeah, I didn't know him personally, obviously, and it was quite some time. I wasn't competing at that stage. I was still staying very fit, but I was doing swimming and some triathlons, but I wasn't competing at a level that would have had me researching training or anything at that point. So when I came to Cape Town, although I still had a fascination with all things sport, I was no longer by any stretch an elite athlete. And I was just at a braai, and a mate of mine mentioned that Prof. Tim Noakes was being quoted about sugar and carbohydrates, and maybe we should rethink that. So I quickly realized that, and it was strange to me that you could have a professor of sports science who was as famous as any of your athletes. I mean, everywhere I went, everybody knew who Prof. Noakes was. So I found that really remarkable to begin with. And then I thought, what an interesting person. So I just sent him an email. There was no intentions, other than just to try and connect with him and understand a bit more about what his research was pointing to, because it was a bit of a void at that point. There wasn't really anything going on at all in this space. So I just wrote to him and said, I'm an ex-athlete, and come from a family of athletes. My father had a heart attack. I've been asking a few questions. This is what I've found. I'd love to know what you think. He invited me in and we spoke for an hour. And at the end, I mean, he blew my mind. Obviously, that's what he does. And he was enormously generous. And without him, we wouldn't be here talking about this, and I wouldn't have made 5 or 6 documentaries, because Serial Killers became his movie. Really, it happened because of Prof. Noakes, and that's really where it all began for me.
So I'm very vocal about my beliefs. Very passionate. somebody like yourself, where do you fit in with regards to, I mean, anyone who knows your movies would establish where you are. But from your own words, where do you, or how do you feel about nutritional advice today, and specifically medical advice today?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say, I'm not a medic, and my wife would tell you I'm certainly not an empath. I don't care what people choose to do. I don't care about saving humanity. I just don't care about any of that. Frankly, I think I think humanity is kind of lost. It's certainly lost its way physically, psychologically, and in many aspects. And I don't see it as my job to do anything about that. I work with people who are in the business of doing something about that, Prof. Noakes being a great example. And I love learning from them, working with them, trying to get their message out. But at the end of the day, I genuinely don't care. You know, friends, family, those close to me, I love to help people when it's relevant and when they're interested. But at this stage, I mean, I noticed after Serial Killers went out, I would meet people and they would stop me and this and that, and you end up in these conversations that last a long time. But then I realized a lot of people will take advice and then not heed it. So they're not really taking advice. They're just interested in maybe the fact that you've made a movie, you've written a book, or you've done something. So I just stopped all of that. I don't engage in those type of conversations anymore. I do what I do. The movies are there. Everything I believe is in the movies, and that's kind of my position. I do think that we've seen the emergence of almost like a parallel society. I think that and I come from a marketing background originally, so I'm fully aware that the big pharma dollars and the ultra processed foods, they are policed by some of the very best PR merchants on the planet, and it is not feasible to think that we can counter that message. So I think you'll only ever get to a small percentage of the population who will, first of all, choose to do the right thing and then execute that. And I honestly don't think that will change. I think we're probably going to get to the point where, I mean, I look at Ireland. I mentioned that there was one plump kid maybe in my class. 2/3 of Irish adults are now overweight or obese. If you look at that opening scene from Serial Killers, my father's, the first big game, they won the national title in 1960. If you look at the crowd, it's more interesting than looking at the pitch. So what you see today are, everybody, the players have got bigger, but so have the crowd. In the 1960s, you had svelte athletes by comparison to today, but they were still very fit. It was just a different era. But the crowd were a much healthier bunch. If there was a couple of big games in Ireland over the weekend, and if you went in there, you would be shocked, because people are they're overweight, they're obese, and nobody really cares. And Ireland's now a country of great wealth, and physically it hasn't worked out for us. And people just indulge, and that's their choice. So I guess that's the long-winded answer to I don't really care.
Would it be correct in saying that I'm gathering from you've been at this for quite some time. I mean, there is a feeling of kind of you jaded at this point, and it's almost as if you're leading the horses to the water, but they're just not drinking. And
yeah, it's a fair point. And we interviewed Dr. John Briffa, and he was one of the very first, like 20 years ago, he was on this, Sean. Great guy. And we interviewed John for Serial Killers. And I got that impression from him. And he says, Jesus, he's like, there's you had, some elements popping up in the US. And he just, he already had the feeling that some of these guys were a bit crazy. He mentioned Jimmy Moore specifically, and Jimmy Moore is now actually in jail for being a pedophile of all things. So, let's call a spade a spade. But John wrote amazing books. Waste Disposal was one of them. And, he had a fantastic blog, which may still be up there, Dr. John Briffa, BRIFFA.com. and then he just went away. He left all the information there. It was like a treasure trove, and then he just went away. And I'm sure he still uses it in clinical practice, but he's not out beating the drum. And I think humans have a tremendous aptitude to disappoint you. So I think John saw that as a doctor, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned the warfare that we find ourselves in, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, if you can be a guardian for your own health, I think that's fantastic. If people are getting there through some other means, I think that's fantastic. Good luck to them. But I just don't care. Yeah,
It's I can really hear frustration from your side, and it's humans have this unbelievable capacity to well, let me just rephrase it. They've got the shortest memories ever. And I think the nutrition that is being programmed upon them has aided this even in creating even a shorter memory. And we forget, and society has been programmed to become apathetic. And mediocrity is now actually becoming the standard. And achieving greatness with hard work is no longer something which people want to hear. And it is a very, very sad thing to hear and also see and witness what some of the brands are even doing with regards to body positivity. Yeah, I can feel your frustration, and I'm just keeping at it. I've sacrificed so much myself, and it's for me. For me, I'm not a philanthropist like yourself, but I do care because the more people's freedoms are encroached upon, and everything starts at the food we eat, the closer they're going to get to encroaching on my freedom. And like we've had a discussion before, I'm just not prepared to become a slave. And that's what the society has become subdued into slavery, and that's the truth.
Well, I think they've like the human body. The frustration for me is that, I mean, the human body is just such an absolutely, it's a masterpiece of design, and what it can do at any age and stage is just is stunning. But you just don't get to see that anymore, and people who haven't at least had a glimpse or a taste of that, I find it remarkable that they don't have the appetite to try and explore what the body can actually do. And I mean, I think back to serial killers. At that stage, I'd done a lot of research into fasting, and there were only two guys who were really doing anything in that space at the time. Brad Pylan was one, and the other guy was Lean Gains, the Swedish bodybuilder. And there was just tumbleweed everywhere. There was nobody. There was just nothing out there. I didn't include it in serial killers because it would have kind of mixed up the message a little bit. But now, a decade later, as I mentioned to you last week, I've started training with a fantastic freediving group here in Cape Town with some world-class athletes in there, and you start to see when you challenge the body, fasting is a lack of food, freediving is a lack of air. You see magical things happen. I mean, it plays with your mind, but it just gives you another glimpse of how remarkable the body we've been given is. So I'm quite happy to explore that on my own. But I just feel that we've lost interest. The human race has lost interest in exploring what we're capable of, aside from, that maybe 8 to 10% of people that I find interesting. But outside of that, physically, I think it's a complete shit show, and I don't see any way around it.
I mean, just so I want to remain in that, but interestingly enough, the United States Navy SEALs were investigating the ketogenic diet to help manage deep sea seizures, and to control and to manage that. I think they decided to go ahead with the ketone esters instead of actually, going forth with ketogenic diet. I'm personally not really a big fan of ketone esters. Your body naturally wants to produce ketones, don't retard it from doing it naturally. But getting back to Professor Tim Noakes, you were obviously following his trial, which, in my opinion, was just heartbreaking to actually see. Because from my standpoint, and I want to hear from your words, it goes to show that there is no real science, or there is minimal science in this in the subject of medicine and nutrition. Because unlike, for instance, physics and astronomy, whereby they've relabeled Pluto as a planet, it was downgraded in 2006 to a dwarf planet, now relabeled to a planet. They in fact change with new revelations, unlike medicine and nutrition. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I think one of the movies I will be making, hopefully down the line, looks at let's say, the industry capture of the regulators and whatnot. I mean, I think the MHRA in the UK, you've got the pharmaceutical companies funding, I believe, 83% of the budget for the regulator. In the US, it's about 2/3 of the new drug research regulatory process is funded by the companies that are feeding into that. So I think industry has captured government, it's captured society, it's captured medicine, it's captured nutrition, it's captured food. And I don't think any individual is to blame for that. I mean, this is systematic, and it started back in the 80s. Reagan relaxed things in 86 for the pharmaceutical companies to export more easily out of the US. 92, George Bush then brought in the user fees scenario whereby they could actually finance the regulator. And now you're at a point where new medications get passed out the gate without any access to raw data, and there's no meaningful oversight. On the food industry front, I mean, it's very clear what's happening there. They're trying to industrialize the process, and in doing so, you introduce heavily refined goods that simply are not healthy. I mean, it's remarkable. But you do see glimpses of hope, because a lot of the plant-based refined foods, the share prices have collapsed recently. And I noticed even during lockdown here in Cape Town, you go to the supermarket and shelves would have been cleaned, but the plant-based burgers and that thing were there in abundance. So I think the human body knows what it needs, and the fact remains that it's just so difficult to push back against the money behind the messaging that is out there. And it is systematic, and it's not even one system. It's a complex, multi-system environment, right down through the financial sector as well, that just continues to approve of and promote corporate profiteering over the health of people and persons, and that's just how it is. So you're either aware of that or you're not. Most people aren't, and if you're not, you're going to be in trouble, and that's it. And we did an audit recently, myself and my wife, just the elders across our family, and we saw that, and these are people up close to 90 years of age. Those who are not taking medications are the only ones, and some of them have had cancer and other things, heart disease, but they refuse to take medications, and they are still going. And yet we have others who are really slowing down, but then you look closely and you realize they're very heavily medicated. And, I'm speaking to cardiologists and some people in that community now who are in favor of withdrawing statins for the elderly towards the end of life, just to try and ward off some dementia-like symptoms, and they're seeing some results there. So I think people just don't know how to think for themselves when it comes to their bodies and the nutrition that they take on board. And I think there will always be consequences for that.
So, I mean, would you agree with me that, I mean, the medical industry is, or I would say, modern Western medicine is just a business, and like I like to phrase it, it's reactive and not proactive, meaning that if they remove the causes of the illnesses, they will effectively go out of business. And the hospital beds will become more vacant. Doctors will see less clients. I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I always go back. Tim Noakes said it in Serial Killers, and he said medicine is a business. And he pointed out at that time, you come back a decade, that, if you were to introduce a non-processed food, low carb type diet, worldwide, you would have about 6 pharmaceutical companies who would go out of business next week. So, that remains the case. And, his insights and his patronage for me has been a wonderful thing for the last decade. And that's why I'm now so keen to tell his story, because to understand where this has all come from and to understand how Prof. Noakes is the person that he is, you need to go all the way back to 1976 when his career started. And that's what we're hoping to do with the new series on Kickstarter. But, people, they've got very short-term memories. I don't think they're that interested themselves in doing the work to go back and, check mark what's happened, what's gone wrong, even for themselves, never mind industry and the medical industry in particular. But it's very clear that there were very distinct pieces of legislation that were entered into during the 80s, 90s and the O's that have brought us to where we are today. And, Dr. Asim Malhotra, that I work closely with, he says that nothing short of legislative change will make any difference whatsoever as we move forward.
Oh, that's a hard pill to swallow. And it's I doubt in my lifetime I will ever see a change in legislation, as people I see around me. I mean, personally, when I go into these small supermarkets, when I stop off my ride and I see people in the queue and they've just got sugar in various kinds of transport packaging, various chocolates, drinks, it's just sugar. And I would come off the bike from halfway, I'm 100 kilometers in and I'm getting water, and the idea of eating is the furthest thing from my mind. And
how dare you, Sean? How dare you?
I know, it's just terrible. But I mean, if you look at the history of mankind, when agriculture started 10,000 years ago, there has been this slow degradation of our strength and our health. And even with technology, I mean, we now have buttons that are in cars that will open your boot for you. And I think the final nails in the coffin with this new chat GPT, which is ultimately going to switch off the thinking mechanism for your brain. And it's the end of mankind. Sorry,
we've outsourced everything. You're absolutely right. We've outsourced everything. Sport and movement is now entertainment. It's something that we watch, not something we engage in. Food is not something we investigate or cook for ourselves or enjoy. It's something that you eat or drink when you're hungry. And as Neville Wellington pointed out, up in Durban during the era of vast sugar production there. They discovered, the local doctor came to the conclusion that over 22 years, if you give somebody the equivalent of about 20 to 22 teaspoons of sugar a day, that's the definition of diabetes. They will absolutely 100% get there. And he was the doctor on site when they started to pay them in sugar up in the plantation. So we know what it is, and we know what to do, but we're not the people in a position to pull those strings. And I can see we've got less than a minute left here, but listen, it's always good to share what you think. I just
could we do some more, because I've got some more questions now that have just sparked